Moving into a new neighborhood should be exciting, right? New home, new beginnings, a fresh start. That's what I thought. But I had no idea that just a few houses away from mine lived a woman who had dedicated her entire existence to making other people miserable. Her name was Karen. And trust me when I say this woman was the final boss of all Karens. She didn't just follow HOA rules. She was the HOA rules. If there was a bylaw, she knew it. If there was a regulation, she enforced it. And if there wasn't a rule that suited her agenda, she'd make one up. I barely had time to unpack my boxes before I started noticing her little reminders in my mailbox. Day 2 in the neighborhood, a note about my grass being slightly overgrown. Day 3, another note, this time about my trash cans being improperly positioned. They were 6 inches too far from the curb. Day 5, a full-blown violation warning about my porch light being too bright and disrupting the community aesthetic. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe the previous homeowner had been a troublemaker, and she just assumed I would be the same. So I tried to be civil. I played along. I mowed my lawn. I repositioned my trash cans like some kind of curb-measuring psychopath. I even changed the wattage on my porch light. Did that satisfy her? Of course not, because this wasn't about rules. This was about control. Karen had decided that I didn't fit into her vision of the neighborhood, and that was all she needed to make my life hell. The complaints kept coming. They got more ridiculous each time. One day, she accused me of leaving my car in the driveway for too long. The next, she claimed my front door color was not in harmony with the community's neutral color palette. It wasn't even a crazy color. It was beige. But the moment I stopped playing her game, the moment I ignored one of her notes, she escalated. She started showing up in person. One Saturday morning, I was in my garage unpacking some tools when I heard a forced, throat-clearing cough. I turned around. There she was, standing at the edge of my driveway like she was inspecting a crime scene. "Excuse me," she said, arms crossed. "We need to talk." I sighed. "About what?" "Your fence." I looked at my fence. "What about it?" "It's exactly 1 inch higher than the HOA guidelines allow," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "You'll need to have it adjusted immediately, or I'll have no choice but to issue a fine." That was it. That was the moment I knew this woman was unhinged. My fence was the same height as my neighbor's, and I knew for a fact nobody else had ever received a complaint. This wasn't about fences. It wasn't about grass. It was about me. She wanted me gone. And what I didn't know at the time, she was about to make her biggest mistake yet. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. I checked my mail expecting the usual HOA nonsense, some petty fine, another complaint about non-compliant shrubbery. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was an official letter. HOA letterhead. Bold, aggressive wording. I opened it. "Dear homeowner," it began. "After careful review, the HOA has determined that your property does not align with the established guidelines and aesthetic values of our community. Due to multiple infractions and ongoing disputes, we have initiated the process to have you removed from the premises. You have 30 days to vacate the property or face legal action." I blinked. Then I read it again. Was this a joke? Karen thought she could evict me? I owned my house. I had a mortgage. I had paperwork. The HOA didn't have that kind of power. But then my eyes landed on the final sentence. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. I froze. Foreclosure. That wasn't just an empty threat. I'd read about HOAs pulling shady moves like this before, abusing obscure bylaws, issuing absurd fines, stacking penalties on top of each other until a homeowner was forced into financial distress. Some HOAs had actually managed to push people out of their own homes through legal loopholes. I had the money to fight back, but this was war. And then it hit me. Karen thought she had me backed into a corner, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. She didn't know that the house she was living in, the one she had been comfortably renting for years, belonged to me. Karen had spent the last several months treating me like an outsider, barking orders, trying to push me out of the neighborhood. But what she didn't know? She was living in my property. A few years ago, before I moved in, I had bought multiple houses in this neighborhood as rental properties. One of them was occupied by a long-term tenant, and that tenant was Karen. She had spent all this time trying to run me out of my home, never realizing that she had been paying rent to me. I checked my files. Yep, her name was right there on the lease agreement. Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA queen, the dictator of the neighborhood, the woman who tried to evict me, was my tenant. And now she was about to find out what it feels like to be on the other side of an eviction notice. That afternoon, I printed out the lease agreement, my property records, and the official termination of tenancy notice, the very same kind of document Karen had tried to hit me with. I took my time walking over to her house, or should I say my house. Karen was outside like always, patrolling the street like she was on a self-appointed security watch. This time, she had cornered one of the neighbors, a poor guy who had the audacity to place his flower pots too close to the sidewalk. As soon as she saw me, she straightened her back and crossed her arms, an insufferable smirk already plastered on her face. "I assume you got the notice," she said. I nodded, keeping my expression unreadable. "Oh, I got it." "It's nothing personal," she continued with that fake saccharine tone that made my skin crawl. "But the HOA has made its decision. We hold our community to high standards, and unfortunately, your presence has been, I cut her off, handing her a document of my own. Her smirk faltered as she took it. I watched, savoring every second as her eyes scanned the words. At first, her brow furrowed, like she couldn't quite comprehend what she was looking at. Then her face slowly drained of color. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. What is this?" she stammered. I leaned in just a little, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "That, Karen, is your eviction notice." She let out a shaky laugh. You can't do this." "Oh, but I can," I said, flipping to the signature page at the bottom of the document. "See, Karen, this house, it belongs to me. You're a tenant, and tenants who break their lease can be legally removed." Her hands shook as she clutched the papers. "You're lying," she whispered, but the panic in her voice told me she knew I wasn't. "You've been violating the terms of your lease for months," I continued, flipping through the document. "Harassment of other residents? Check. Unauthorized alterations to the property? Check. Interfering with legal property ownership?" I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that's a big check." Her breathing got heavier. She was scrambling for an excuse, a loophole, anything that would give her the upper hand. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. I smiled. "That depends. Are you stepping down from your little HOA throne, or are you stepping out of my house? Either way, Karen, your reign is over." Her jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might crack a tooth. But I didn't wait for a response. I turned around and walked away, leaving her standing there, clutching her own eviction notice in trembling hands. And that was just the beginning. The next morning, I wasn't even out of bed before I got the email. Subject line: illegal eviction notice, violation of HOA bylaws. I sighed. Oh, here we go. The email was exactly what I expected, a bunch of legal-sounding nonsense clearly written under Karen's orders. "Dear homeowner," it read, "it has come to our attention that you have engaged in unauthorized eviction proceedings against a resident of our community. The HOA has strict rules against retaliatory actions and unlawful displacement of residents. Any attempts to remove a member of this community without due process will result in immediate fines and further legal action. Please consider this your official warning." I actually laughed. Karen was desperate. She was trying to weaponize the HOA to save herself. But what she didn't understand? HOA rules don't override state laws. I wasn't kicking her out because I didn't like her. I wasn't breaking some made-up community rule. I was evicting a tenant who had breached her lease. And Karen? She was out of moves. But I wasn't about to let her get away with this little stunt. I cracked my knuckles and typed out my response. "Dear HOA compliance team," I began. "Thank you for your message. I appreciate your concern regarding unlawful evictions. However, Karen is not a resident of the community in the sense you describe. She is my tenant. As the legal owner of her property, I have the right to terminate her lease for cause, which I have already done in accordance with state and federal housing laws. My decision is not subject to HOA oversight. Furthermore, any attempts by the HOA to interfere with lawful landlord-tenant matters could be considered harassment. Should this continue, I will not hesitate to take legal action against both Karen and the HOA. Best regards, your favorite landlord." I hit send and sat back. Let's see how she liked having the rules used against her. A few hours later, I heard a knock at my door. I already knew who it was. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on my porch. "Sir, we need to speak with you regarding a complaint," one of them said. I let out a deep sigh. "Let me guess," I said. "Karen called you?" They exchanged a glance. "She did," one of them admitted. "She claims you're attempting an unlawful eviction and using intimidation tactics." I almost rolled my eyes. Of course she did. "Come on in," I said, stepping aside. "I've got plenty to show you." I pulled up everything. Karen's lease agreement, signed and dated with my name at the top. The termination notice, which was perfectly legal under our state's landlord-tenant laws. The email from the HOA, and my response. The officers took their time reading through it all. Finally, one of them sighed and looked at his partner. "This is all legal," he muttered. "Yeah," the other officer agreed. "She's not being evicted unlawfully. The lease was terminated correctly." I crossed my arms. "So, am I good?" The first officer nodded. "You're good." They stood up, thanked me for my time, and left. But before they did, they made a little stop at Karen's house. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I did hear this. "Ma'am, this is a civil issue, not a police matter. Do not call us again unless there's a real emergency." That was the first real crack in Karen's armor. She was realizing she wasn't untouchable, and she had no idea that things were about to get a whole lot worse. For the next 30 days, Karen became a one-woman war machine. She refused to accept reality. She refused to pack her bags, and she damn sure refused to go down quietly. Instead of preparing to move out like a normal, rational person, she launched a full-blown campaign to stall the eviction. First, she went back to her favorite tool of terror, the HOA. She demanded an emergency meeting, trying to rally her little minions to take action against unlawful landlords. She wanted the HOA to pass a motion that would make it impossible to evict her. The board didn't even bother voting on it. Turns out, even the other HOA members were tired of her. One of my neighbors, an older guy named Bill, who had been living here for over 20 years, came over and told me exactly what went down. "She threw a fit," he chuckled, sipping his beer on my porch. "Said you were disrupting the harmony of the community and that we should all band together to fight your injustice." I raised an eyebrow. And? Bill smirked. "Someone on the board told her, 'Karen, we can't help you. He owns the house. You're a tenant. That's how this works.'" And the look on her face? Priceless. I laughed. Karen was losing control, and she knew it. But she wasn't done yet. Next, she tried a new strategy. She filed a harassment complaint against me. Oh yeah, full-on victim mode activated. She actually went to the police station and claimed I was stalking her, intimidating her, and trying to force her out of the neighborhood through psychological warfare. I got a call from a local officer who had to follow up on her report. "Sir," he said, clearly tired, "we got a complaint from a Karen, last name." I sighed. "Let me guess, she's claiming I'm harassing her?" The officer actually chuckled. "Yeah, something about you trying to ruin her life and force her into homelessness." I let out a sharp breath. I haven't even spoken to her since I handed her the eviction notice. "That's what I figured," he said. "She didn't have any proof, and when we asked for evidence, she just ranted about HOA violations for 15 minutes. I rubbed my temples. "So, what happens now?" "We're not moving forward with anything," he assured me, "but I'd keep an eye out. She's desperate, and desperate people do stupid things." And he was right, because Karen, she was about to pull her craziest stunt yet. The eviction deadline was tomorrow. 30 days had passed, and Karen, she hadn't packed a single box. Her porch still had her flower pots. Her car was still parked in the driveway. She still patrolled the street every morning, pretending like nothing was happening. I knew she was planning something. And sure enough, that night she made her move. At 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a car revving loudly. I got out of bed, peeked through my blinds, and what do I see? Karen, spray painting the front of her own house. My house. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, she was actively vandalizing the property. Big, bold letters. Slumlord scum. Neighborhood terrorist. Corrupt landlord. And the best part? She was doing it on camera. I had installed a doorbell cam weeks ago after the whole fake harassment report, and she hadn't noticed. I grabbed my phone and hit record, and then I called the cops. "Yeah, I'd like to report someone vandalizing private property," I said calmly. "Oh, and it's all on video." They were at my house within 10 minutes. 2 officers rolled up, shining their lights right on Karen mid-spray. She froze. Her entire face turned ghost white. One of the officers stepped out. "Ma'am, what exactly are you doing?" Karen panicked. She dropped the spray can and tried to run inside. "Ma'am, stop right there!" She didn't listen. She bolted for the door. And guess what? They arrested her right there in her pajamas for vandalizing her own rental. As they put her in cuffs, she was screaming at the top of her lungs, "You can't do this! This is my house!" The officer calmly responded, "No, ma'am, it's his house, and you just committed a crime on camera." I just stood there, arms crossed, watching the nightmare of the neighborhood finally crumble. And the best part? She was still scheduled to be evicted the next morning. One way or another, she was leaving. The next day, right on schedule, the sheriff's department arrived. 2 uniformed officers, a locksmith, and a cleanup crew. Karen wasn't home. She was still in jail. I stood across the street watching as the locksmith changed the locks. A few of the neighbors came outside to watch. They weren't sad. They weren't upset. They were relieved. Bill, my beer-drinking neighbor, walked up next to me. "Can't believe she actually went to jail," he muttered. "That's one hell of a way to go out." I smirked. She left me no choice. 30 minutes later, the officers finished their job. The locks were changed. The paperwork was signed. And just like that, Karen was officially gone. No more power trips. No more HOA nonsense. No more reign of terror. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the now vacant house that Karen had once ruled from like a dictator. It was finally over. And then My phone buzzed. An email from the HOA. "Dear homeowner," it read, "due to recent vacancies, there is now an open seat on the HOA board. As a valued member of the community, we would like to extend an invitation for you to apply." I let out a laugh, a loud, genuine, victorious laugh. After everything, they wanted me to take her place. Yeah, that wasn't going to happen. But knowing that Karen, wherever she was, would have to live with the fact that she had lost everything, that was more than enough for me. 15 minutes. That's how long Karen had to collect her things and leave. The officer stood by the door, arms crossed, waiting. The locksmith had already changed the locks. The legal eviction notice had been posted on the front of the house for days. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and official. But Karen was still standing there, seething. Her face was twisted in rage, her eyes darting between the officers, the locksmith, and me. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to find an escape, a loophole, some last-minute miracle that would let her stay. But there wasn't one. She had lost. The smug arrogance she once carried was completely gone. No more condescending lectures about community standards. No more weaponizing the HOA to enforce her will. Now? She was just another evicted tenant standing on a porch that didn't belong to her anymore. The officer sighed, looking at his watch. "Ma'am, your time is almost up. I suggest you start moving." Karen clenched her fists. She wanted to fight, but she also knew she couldn't. Instead, she let out a bitter, forced laugh. "You're making a mistake," she spat, glaring at me. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "This neighborhood," she hissed, waving a dramatic hand around. "This community, it needs structure, it needs rules, and without me, it's going to fall apart. You'll see." I smirked. "Somehow, I think we'll manage." Her nostrils flared. But she had nothing left. No power, no authority. And now, no home. With a sharp huff, she turned on her heel and stormed inside. I heard the sound of things being yanked, drawers being slammed, cabinets being thrown open. One of the officers took a step forward. "Ma'am, I advise you not to damage the property." Karen ignored him. She was furious. She knocked over chairs, tossed papers onto the floor. At one point, I heard a loud crash like she had thrown something against the wall. "Should I press charges for property damage?" I asked, loud enough for her to hear. The noise inside immediately stopped. I smirked. "Thought so." A few minutes later, Karen reappeared in the doorway, dragging a single suitcase. It was almost pathetic. 30 days. She had been given 30 days to prepare, and yet here she was with one bag of belongings, standing at the entrance of a house that no longer belonged to her. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. I could tell she wanted to say something. Maybe one last insult, maybe some dramatic declaration about how I had ruined everything. But nothing came. Because what could she possibly say? She had lost, and she knew it. Without another word, she walked past me, suitcase dragging behind her, and got into her car. I watched as she gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Then, without even looking back, she sped off. Gone. For good. The locksmith locked the front door behind her. The officers gave me a nod, confirming that everything was official. And just like that, Karen was history. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more bullshit fines, no more passive-aggressive notes, no more power-hungry HOA nonsense. And the best part? People were happy. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up were suddenly chatting in their yards. People were working on their gardens again, no longer worried about Karen nitpicking over the wrong type of flowers. Bill, good old beer-drinking Bill, walked over to my porch, arms crossed, grinning like a man who had just witnessed the greatest event of his life. "Well," he said, tipping his head toward the now vacant house. That was something? Yeah, I chuckled. It was. He let out a long sigh, shaking his head. Damn shame we didn't throw a block party to celebrate. I laughed. It's not too late. He clapped me on the back. You know what? You might be right. And honestly, I was so tempted. The HOA had been silent for weeks. Karen was gone. Everything felt lighter. Until my phone buzzed. A new email from the HOA. I sighed, already expecting some ridiculous complaint about violating noise ordinances or disrupting the aesthetic balance of the community. But when I opened it, I almost fell over laughing. Dear homeowner, due to recent vacancies, there is now an open seat on the HOA board. As a valued member of the community, we would like to extend an invitation for you to apply. Oh, this was too good. The same HOA that had let Karen run wild, the same HOA that tried to fine me, threaten me, and evict me, now wanted me to join them. Bill noticed my face and raised an eyebrow. What? What is it? I turned my phone so he could see. He read the email. And then he laughed so hard he had to sit down. Oh, you have to do it, he gasped between breaths. You have to take that seat. I shook my head, still smirking. Nah, not worth it. Come on, he grinned. Imagine the look on their faces if you walked into the next meeting. Tempting? So tempting, but honestly, I didn't need to be on the board. Because Karen was gone. The neighborhood was finally at peace. And best of all, wherever Karen was now, wherever she had gone to rebuild her miserable little kingdom, she knew. She knew that she had lost, and that was enough for me.